Hey everybody, so today we're going to be talking about section 5.15, which is about sustainable agriculture. Now, I know that we talked about agricultural practices with 5.4 and some of the benefits and some of the problems. So today we're going to be talking about how to do it a little bit more sustainably and some of the options that farmers have. So the learning objective for today is that you can describe sustainable agriculture and food production practices. We'll learn about some things about like soil conservation, methods for doing this, how to improve soil fertility, and different strategies that can be used in order to, again, make farming more sustainable. So when we're talking about soil conservation, these are going to be the agricultural techniques that minimize erosion. Remember that topsoil is going to be really beneficial. It has a lot of that are nutrients in there and some of the biologic like bacteria that break down things. So we want to preserve topsoil. But because of our current practices, the United States is losing topsoil to erosion 10 times faster than it can form. So this goal of trying to have soil conservation is so that we can actually minimize erosion so that we can not be losing that topsoil at such a rapid rate. Some other benefits is this is going to prevent the loss of nutrients in the topsoil. It's going to help us have more soil moisture. We're going to have more decomposers in the topsoil, and we're going to prevent loss of organic matter that's going to trap our soil moisture. So there's a few different ways that we can look at preventing some runoff erosion. So one of these is going to be what's called contour plowing. And this is where you plow parallel to natural slopes in the land instead of down slopes. And this is going to prevent water runoff, which contributes to soil erosion. So it's going to form these little mini terraces that catch water running off, and it's going to help conserve soil and water. So this picture here is going to be a diagram of what this can look like, especially if you have kind of slow hills. This is going to be a way to sort of force a bit of terracing so that you're able to still get the benefits of it. Now, if we want to talk about actual terracing, this is going to be where you go and actually cut flat platforms into the soil. So contour plowing is just more like kind of faking it when you're creating crops and plow lines. Terracing is where you're actually going and cutting into these steep slopes. And this is going to help these flat terraces catch water and prevent it from becoming runoff and eroding soil. So if you see this image here, this is going to be great in areas that are really steep and hilly, and it makes it so they can actually farm in places that maybe originally would not be able to do so if we just had the really steep with tons of runoff and soil and crops eroding. Now, another tactic is using perennial crops. And these are going to be crops that live year-round, and they're harvested at numerous times. They're going to have longer, more established roots and prevention of the bare soil between harvests because these plants are going to stay. So you might just be removing things like berries from them, but the actual plant itself stays and the roots become more established. And remember that vegetation is going to prevent erosion. So if you look at this diagram here, like on the right-hand side is over time. With these perennial ones, you're going to get a lot more of the roots into the soil. On the left-hand side is annual, ones that are just pulled out every single year. You don't get as much of that root protection of the topsoil, and so you're going to be more prone to erosion. So some other strategies that we have to prevent erosion, one of them is going to be windbreaks. And this is where you use trees or other plants to block the force of the wind from eroding topsoil. This is another benefit because you can actually use those trees as a source of firewood, or if they're fruit-producing trees, you can use the fruit as income, and it can be great for pollinators, which can help with your other crops as well. And not just pollinators, but other species. So things like birds are going to be able to live in those trees. So this picture on the left is going to show you where we've got some trees growing on the left. We've got the crops here. If you've ever driven through Eastern Washington and sees the rows of like cypress trees, this is what they're doing. And if you look at this diagram, it shows you how the wind actually kind of hits these trees and gets pushed up above them and passes over the crops. So that's how these windbreaks work, because the wind isn't able to come and blow the topsoil away. Another thing that can be done is not tilling crops. So not having those massive plows that are going to go and just rip up the entire top layer. You're actually going to leave the leftover crops remains in the soil instead of tilling under it. So this is going to add organic matter to the soil, which provides nutrients, soil cover, and more moisture because the organic matter is going to trap it in there, which ultimately is going to prevent soil erosion from this loose and dusty soil. So if you look at this diagram here, on the left-hand side is when it's not tilled. You can actually see those healthy soil horizons with some organic matter that can break down and be part of the topsoil. On the right-hand side is what happens when you have increased tilling, where you're going to just leave to this really crusty, dry soil that's going to be way easier eroded when wind comes in. Another thing is going to be strip cropping, and this is another name for intercropping, and that's where you're going to alternate rows of dense crops like hay and wheat with rows of less dense crops like corn, soy, and cotton to prevent runoff from eroding the soil from the less dense rows of crops. So you have them switching and alternating between them. So we have some ways for improving our soil fertility. So getting more of those nutrient levels like the potassium, calcium, magnesium, nitrogen. And one of the ways that you can do this is through crop rotation. So if you replant the exact same crops in the same place every year, it's going to deplete the soil of the same nutrients because each plant needs specific different types of nutrients. So they're going to pull from it and you'll just keep taking the same nutrients in the same spot if you keep them every year after year. This is why you want to do crop rotation. It actually allows the soil to recover from nitrogen, especially demanding crops like corn. And one of the ones that's actually really good to rotate in there is going to be peas or beans, which are legumes. So anything from the legume family, including peanuts. They actually have nitrogen fixing bacteria in their root nodules that can return nitrogen to the soil. So those bacteria, remember, they fix it from the atmosphere, and that's how we're going to get it in a usable form that future plants are going to be able to use. So if you are going to have legumes, as you rotate it, like let's say year one, you plant corn, it's going to deplete some of the nitrogen. If the next year you go in and you plant some legumes, then they're going to fix nitrogen. You're going to get more in the soil, and it will help to recover the nitrogen levels in that soil. Another way that we can improve soil fertility is through something called green manure. And this is going to be leftover plant matter from a cover crop. So a crop that's planted in the off season between harvest and replanting of the main crops. So if you think about in the fall when all the crops have been harvested, what you can do is actually go and plant a cover crop that can just grow during the winter. And it will help to stabilize the soil, which will limit topsoil erosion. And at the very end, when you're ready to go and plant new things, you can leave the remains of the cover crops, which is what's called the green manure, left on the field, and that organic matter is going to be able to break down and release nutrients into the soil. So this would be an example here. Like when you're all done with the corn, you've harvested it, you can go through and you can actually leave it on the top there so that it's going to be able to actually break down and give those nutrients back into the soil. And then this would be another example of if you grew like a grass type cover and then you get all the clippings, it returns it so that later when you go and you grow something else there, they're going to have more nutrients in the soil for them. Another way to improve soil fertility is limestone. I had to do this to my soil because it was very acidic. And so I added lime to it because lime is going to release calcium carbonate, which is a base. And so when you add it to the soil, it's going to neutralize it so that the soil is no longer acidic because plants don't love really acidic soil. The reason why is because acidic soil has really high hydrogen ion concentrations, which displaces the positive charged nutrients from the soil and it leaches them out. So we have a lot of positively charged, like calcium, magnesium. I think potassium is also positively charged. And so when you have a lot of these hydrogen ions, it's going to lead to leaching out of the nutrients that we actually need. So non-acidic soil is going to hold those positively charged nutrients better. So if you look at this diagram here, if we're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, these are going to be the levels at different pHs. So down here at a lower pH where it's more acidic at 4.5, we clearly have less nutrient availability than 7, which is going to be at our neutral pH level. So that's why you want your soil to be neutral. Another reason you don't want acidic soil is because it makes toxic metals like aluminum more soluble in the soil, and plants can potentially take those up in their roots. So we don't want toxic metals in our soil. And if you look here, really acidic, we have higher levels of aluminum concentration, which can actually get to toxic levels for some species that might be living in the soil there. And if we get it to a lower pH, you're going to have less aluminum concentration, which is going to be a lot healthier for all those animals who live in the soil. Oh, also, the reason why limestone is good is because calcium carbonate is being introduced, and calcium is a needed plant nutrient. So in addition to all these other benefits, you're also just giving another nutrient into the soil. So one thing that can be done is called rotational grazing. And this is where you have regular rotation of livestock to different pastures in order to prevent overgrazing. Overgrazing, if you have your livestock staying in the same area and just eating your grass down to the stubs, it can kill plants. It's going to compact soil because they keep stepping on it in the same areas, which ultimately is going to lead to erosion of that topsoil. So by doing rotational grazing, you can actually promote pasture growth at a faster than normal rate. So if you've got like a big square acreage, maybe you have it divided into 4 quadrants. So for 1 month, you have them in the upper quadrant, and then you just move them every few months, and that's how you would do that rotational grazing. So when you have these animals going and feeding on the grass, they're going to be clipping the grass back to a length where growth is fastest, and it actually is going to encourage deeper root growth. So if we look at this diagram here, when you have overgrazing in an area, the grass is going to stay at these really low levels, which can actually lead to it dying. They aren't able to do photosynthesis in order to succeed because you keep taking off all of the leaves. But then also, if it's left around for too long, it goes to seed, and then it dies once it goes to seed. So in the middle here is where you're going to have the best growth rate because it's not going to die off of going to seed, but it has enough of these leaves to continue to do photosynthesis and thrive and get deeper root layers. And this is going to be the level where your grass is getting eaten down to if you are doing this crop rotation. So it's going to make it so that the topsoil is going to be healthier, but also the grass is you're going to have thicker, more available grass for your livestock, and the roots are going to be protecting that topsoil from erosion. And this is just another example here of what these roots and the health of the grass is going to look like if it's more rotated. So versus when it's just constantly getting chewed down, versus if it has a few weeks in between when it's being eaten, it's going to be much healthier of a plant, and it's going to be much healthier for keeping that topsoil. So your practice FRQ for 5.15, you're going to practice the skill of making a claim that proposes a solution to an environmental problem in an applied context. So I want you to look at this picture here. It's kind of like a hilly grassland area. And I want you to describe 2 soil conservation strategies that could be used to prevent soil erosion in agricultural fields that are established in this landscape. So pretend farmers were coming in, they were going to plant a bunch of crops here. What are 2 things that they could do for soil conservation strategies? So that will be your practice FRQ 5.15, and those were your notes on 5.15 about sustainable agricultural practices.